Welcome back to Shame, Self-Abandonment, and the Pornography Trap. I'm Dr. Chuck, and today we are going to dig deeper into where male shame begins. Because while many men come into counseling focused on stopping a behavior like porn or emotional withdrawal, the deeper work always begins earlier, much earlier. And today we'll explore how shame forms in childhood and adolescence, not in a single moment, but as a system of interpretation that teaches boys how to see themselves, how to hide their emotional needs, and how to conform to the world's definition of what it means to be a man. We're going to look at 5 foundational frameworks. First, Erik Erikson's developmental stages. Second, Silvan Tomkins' affect theory. Third, Donald Nathanson's shame spiral, and in particular, the compass of shame. Fourth, object relations theory and parental shame messaging. And fifth, Bandura's social learning theory and gender norms. These aren't just academic theories. They are practical lenses for understanding how a man's deepest struggles often begin in places he doesn't even remember. Let's start with the earliest stages of identity formation. So first we have Erik Erikson in what he called shame versus autonomy. Erikson's model of psychological development tells us that between the ages of 18 months and 3 years, a child enters the stage of autonomy versus shame and doubt. This is when toddlers begin to assert independence. I do it myself. You hear that in what we call the terrible twos. They are discovering their will, their ability to make choices and affect the world. But what happens when those early efforts are not met with guidance, but with harshness? What if the parent scolds, mocks, or over-controls the child's behavior? Now, I want you to think about it for a moment. Between boys and girls, which one has the stronger will? Usually boys. Which one wants to explore the world more aggressively? Usually boys. Which ones tend to assert their power the most? Usually boys. Boys tend to explore more aggressively, more thoroughly, more adventuresome at that age. And so who gets corrected more often? Usually boys. So think about that. Girls tend to respond more to relational correction and words. Boys tend to want to assert themselves, and they don't like cooperative play, and they don't really like cooperation at all. At that age, the child doesn't interpret correction the way we would. The child does not necessarily think, oh, that correction means my behavior was bad. Their interpretation is, I am bad. See, this is where shame begins to take root in a deep, early, personal soil of understanding. If a child is consistently experiencing disapproval or belittling at this stage, they may come to believe that his autonomy is dangerous and that his value is conditional. This lays the groundwork for later self-doubt and emotional suppression. So, at age 3, the boy begins to trade authenticity for approval. He'd rather be approved by his parents than necessarily be autonomous. The shame tells him, I can't be me because me is bad. I'll be what they want me to be so I can be accepted. This is where the beginnings of people-pleasing sometimes takes hold. Next, we'll turn to Silvan Tomkins and the power of affect. Affect is a word that kind of means feeling. Silvan Tomkins, a pioneer of affect theory, identified shame as one of the 9 human affects, hardwired emotional responses that shape how we relate to the world. Shame, in Tomkins' view, is not just a feeling of embarrassment, it's a sudden collapse of positive affect. In other words, shame occurs when something that was emotionally engaging, like joy, excitement, curiosity, suddenly becomes interrupted. A boy runs towards his father with pride in a drawing, and his father barely looks up. That interpretation is shame, a feeling of being diminished in the presence of another. And here's the key. Shame is relational. It is not experienced in isolation. It always involves the self in relation to a significant other. That's why its effects are so long-lasting. It's not just that I felt bad, it's that you saw me as not good enough. And now I see myself that way. Shame becomes a lens, a filter through which boys interpret feedback. They interpret relationships, and they see failure, and they see emotion. Donald Nathanson created what he called the shame spiral and the compass of shame. He built on Tomkins' work of affect and introduced the idea of the shame spiral. He observed that shame can be recursive, meaning it goes back and kind of reinforces itself. You feel ashamed, and then ashamed for feeling ashamed. This creates the collapse of self. Boys are especially prone to this because they often are taught that emotions like sadness, fear, or neediness are themselves shameful. So when a boy feels emotional pain, he also feels defective. He tries to suppress it, hide it, or attack it. So Nathanson mapped 4 main defenses against shame, which he called the compass of shame, because it has 4 compass points, 4 directions. The first is withdrawal, going silent, isolating, or hiding. The second is to attack the self through self-criticism or perfectionism or depression. Number 3 is avoidance, to distract yourself or others through humor, through work, or through addictions. And number 4 is to attack others through blaming or criticism or aggression. These become the default emotional operating systems for most boys. They learn not to process shame, but to deflect it in one of these 4 ways. To turn it inward or to turn it outward. Ultimately, to run from it. And later in life, these patterns fuel compulsive coping, especially with pornography. In objects relations theory, identity is shaped by the way a child is mirrored by their caregiver. The object is the internalized image of the parent, what we hold in our heads about our parent, the image. It becomes part of the child's self-development. If a boy is constantly met with empathy, attunement, which is alignment, and appropriate boundaries, he internalizes a sense of self-worth that is stable. But if he's met with shaming messages, conditionally or emotionally absent parenting, he internalizes a sense of inadequacy and unworthiness. This is especially true if it's coming from his father. Fathers in particular carry symbolic weight in a boy's development. When a father mocks, ignores, or harshly disciplines emotional vulnerability, the boy learns that his softer emotions are unwelcome. Many men try to toughen up their boys because they don't want them to be taken advantage of in the world. Remember, fathers were once boys too, and they know how tough the world can be on boys. They know how tough the other boys are going to be on their sons. They know how harsh it is when a boy shows vulnerability or emotionality on the playground. So they try to toughen up their boys, and sometimes they do that with passive-aggressive behavior or negative messaging, and they think they're helping their son. But the emotional vulnerability they see in their son that scares the father makes the boy vulnerable to harm developmentally. So the boy builds what Winnicott called the false self, a persona that performs acceptably, especially to the father, but also to the mother and to the world, while hiding the truth behind it. They hide what they think is their faultiness or their inadequacy or their unworthiness. They push that down and they put up a masquerade, a false self that the world will accept, of competency and invulnerability. Many men enter adulthood having never shed this false self. They live behind that mask their entire life. And then when life breaks through the mask, through failure, through betrayal, through addiction, the unprotected self beneath the mask, the unprotected self that's never been understood or confronted or even developed well, is flooded with shame. And the men go into crisis. And then the compass reactivates and they flee, inward or outward. Albert Bandura's social learning theory teaches us that children learn behaviors through observation, through imitation, and through reinforcement. This is especially relevant for boys because the traits they are taught to admire and imitate are highly restrictive. From a young age, boys are rewarded for strength, independence, and competitiveness. They are often shamed, directly or indirectly, for tenderness, emotional expression, or relational sensitivity. This creates what researchers like Levant and Mahalik have called normative male alexithymia, which is a condition where men are literally struggling to identify and articulate their emotions. You can call it emotional blindness. They've been trained out of the ability to see or understand their own emotions. They're not emotionally broken. They're emotionally untrained, or more accurately, they're trained not to see them. And the shame of not knowing how to feel or how to say what they feel only reinforces their silence. You can see this when a wife says, "Tell me how you feel," and the man says, "I don't know." And then they feel ashamed that they can't tell their wife something as simple as how they feel. I see this in the counseling room all the time. So when these boys grow up and encounter the storms of adult life, marital stress, work failure, fatherhood fatigue, they are without the emotional tools. But the shame doesn't wait for it. It whispers, "You should be stronger. You're not enough. Real men don't fall apart." And then the shame continues to build. I remember I was working with a foster kid who was about 17 years old. He wanted to put together a bookshelf he bought, a little 3x3 bookshelf. And it was very simple. It was kind of like an IKEA thing. He got it at Walmart. And it said, get a hammer, get a screwdriver, put it together. He couldn't for the life of him figure out, because no one had ever taught him how to use tools. Nobody. I mean, he couldn't figure it out, and it was a mess. He made a mess. So I went in there and I had to help him do it. He was so ashamed of the work he had done because it was a simple task, but he'd never used a screwdriver before. He was a foster kid who grew up in a female house with a drug addict mom. He'd never, ever touched tools before. And he just couldn't conceive of how to even drive a screw into a pre-drilled hole. And it was sad, but he was so ashamed that he was ready to break down crying, and he got angry, and he just started beating on the thing. See, as a male, he felt inadequate. Instead of asking for help, he got mad at the object. That's how shame cycles into something other than shame. It turned to anger, because anger is something he knew. So let's put all the threads together. From Erikson's earliest stage of autonomy versus shame, to Tomkins' biological affect system, to Nathanson's emotional defenses, to the mirroring of parents, to the conditioning of culture, a boy is taught that who he is not enough. He doesn't just feel emotions, he learns to fear emotions. He doesn't just receive correction, he internalizes failure. He doesn't just want approval, he fears rejection. And so he builds a life of performance, a mask. He becomes a good boy, a strong one, a quiet achiever. But beneath that mask is the same wounded child, longing to be known, terrified to be seen. This is why so many men find themselves unraveling, not just when life falls apart, but when they succeed and it still doesn't silence the inner critic. This is the trap, not just porn, not just addiction, but the shame itself. In the next episode, we'll look at what happens when this shame collides with the male emotional code. We'll explore why men suppress, deny, and abandon their emotions, and how that sets them up for cycles of compulsive behavior, including porn use. We'll also begin to explore how pornography offers temporary escape from shame, but only reinforces the very thing men are trying to flee from. If today's episode stirred something in you, stay with us. Share it with a colleague, a client, or a friend. We're building a conversation that has been missing for too long. I'm Dr. Chuck, and this is Shame, Self-Abandonment, and the Pornography Trap. Thanks for listening.